Hi, I'm Mildly Gothic, and I'm turning myself into Morticia Addams for Halloween. So let's talk dress construction. So Morticia Addams, as I kind of talked about in my last video, I went through a little bit more about like where I'm drawing my inspiration from, so if you want to see that, check that out. But her classic silhouette is some form of typically like a mermaid style. Early on, you'll typically see, or you will see, that her dress really wasn't. It was kind of more straight and it had like these weird tentacles on the floor, which kind of then got interpreted later as a mermaid, and that's kind of the visual motif that's been stuck with since. So there's a couple different ways you can achieve a mermaid shape. The most classic way is the dress just flares. Like the panels that are made have flare at the bottom, so the dress just flares at the bottom and you get that nice shape. Mermaid flares typically start at or below the knee. Trumpet style is when you see it more in the mid-thigh. One of the other ways you can achieve this is a seam at the knees. I personally do not like the way this looks. I've never liked it when I've seen it in wedding dresses, evening gowns, pageant dresses, none of it, never liked it. I know why it exists, and it's so that you can get more of a floof, because you are limited in the amount that you can flare fabric like that when you do it as one panel. If you put a seam there, you can do gathers or pleats or all sorts of things, and that essentially lets you get a much poofier skirt. That's not really the vibe I'm going for. Morticia does not floof, so that is not what I want to do. But at the same time, I want a little bit more structure than just the subtle flare. So what I'm choosing to do is use godets. I may be pronouncing that wrong, and if I am, I'm pronouncing it wrong throughout this entire video, so I am so sorry. But what this is a triangle of fabric that you put in at a seam. This can be done at any length of skirt. People do it when they change like straight cut jeans to flare jeans and they put those in the sides. You can do this on literally any seam. You're just adding a triangle of fabric. There may be more to the actual definition. As far as I know, it's essentially just adding a triangle of fabric. So I'm going to do that in the skirt, because what it means is I can panel the construction of my dress so that it fits me very well, and then add triangles at the seams to get that flare, because one of the other things that I'm doing is I'm going to be adding a slit to the dress. The reason why I'm really worried about a couple things. One, fit. I really want to make sure this thing fits me, and I want to be able to sit down, so that kind of the second thing is mobility. I want to be able to walk, I want to be able to sit down. Because I'm using a non-stretch fabric, I'm very worried about when I sit down, things popping or ripping, just because it's going to be very tight over my thighs. So if the dress has some way to give, as in a slit in the dress, I do think that it just will help me out a little bit better if maybe the fit isn't perfect or it's a little wonky in some areas. Plus, I think it'll look nice. But that's another reason I went with the godets, is if you ever look at mermaid dresses that then also have a leg slit, they look weird. They don't hang properly. It loses the floof at the bottom, which is the whole point of the mermaid. So my hope and my thought is by doing godets that naturally have more structure to them, when I have an opening in the dress, you will still get the visual effect of the mermaid without losing the function and mobility that the slit helps and offers. So that's kind of why I'm doing that. I am fully aware that there is, to my knowledge, no Morticia dress that uses this construction. Typically, you do see that it is just simple panels that have been draped appropriately with minor bust seams. She doesn't even really have like fully paneled dresses. So most of the reference photos I can find is it looks like they basically probably do side bust darts and just deal with it at the side seams. They are not really paneled. I chose to do a very paneled construction for this. Maybe to my own detriment in some of the later steps, we'll see. But this is what made sense to me as far as how to approach this, because not including panels in a dress like this requires a higher level of understanding of fabric draping and construction. And while I can sew, I would not call myself a designer, even though I've like drafted all my own patterns. I'm typically copying from clothing I already have, or mapping it out on the dress form so that it fits me properly. So paneling just made sense for my skill set, except that's not what I'm doing for the lace layer. The lace layer, I do want to have as few seams in it as possible for aesthetic purposes. So I do know that that's going to be an extra challenge, but I chose to do godets for whatever that means. The image of the dress that I'm copying, I'm pretty sure it's a knee seam in that dress. If you look at this image and you look kind of at where it starts to floof, it's narrow, and then there's like a bump, and I'm pretty sure that is all of the extra fabric making that floof for the bottom part of the dress. I just don't like that look, so that's not what I'm doing, and this is my costume, so I can do what I want. We'll see how it turns out, but this video is going to be making that skirt, making that dress, making the bottom. I had said in the last video that I was going to be doing the sleeves next. You'll see at the end why I kind of decided to go in a different direction for a little bit, and I'm very glad I did. I think I've made a lot of progress, but there is still a lot to come. So with that babble about dress construction out of the way, let's get into how I made this skirt. What I'm going to do now is create a pattern that will help me figure out the bottom of this. Because while this dress form has hips, and she does have something that is attempting to kind of give form to the butt, it's not great, and I've never made something that's supposed to be this fitted to my form before. So what we're going to do is a Sarah Spaceman classic, also just a general cosplay classic, and we are going to make a duct tape pattern. For that, I am wearing a nondescript t-shirt and shorts, and I'm going to get wrapped in saran wrap and duct tape, because that's how we're going to make this pattern. I'm going to try to stand as neutrally as possible, how I would stand while wearing this dress, and my boyfriend's going to help me out so that I can then cut this off of me to have a pattern. I've never done this before. Seems to be the theme of this project.
So I said saran wrap, but what we actually ended up using was moving plastic because it comes on a roll with a nice easy handle. Jacob was the one doing this because as the person who is getting the pattern made of, you really don't want to move. You want to stay as still as possible. And one of the other keys is you want to not roll this too tight around yourself. If you go too tight, you are actually likely morphing and distorting the actual shape of your body, which makes it really hard to get an accurate depiction. That's easy enough in the plastic to avoid, but when it comes to the duct tape layer, it's much, much harder. We did the duct tape by just using it as one continuous strip all the way around me. However, for some more complicated forms, you can kind of rip it off into strips and piecemeal it around and make sure that you accurately capture the form. Again, you don't want to pull it too tight. You're going to be distorting the shape of your body, because the whole point of doing this sort of pattern making is to get something more accurate than you would be able to get otherwise. When you're done and it comes time to cut it off, take care, be patient, and this is why you probably should wear clothing you don't care about, just in case. So once I had the base form done, I pinned it to the dress form, and the next part was actually mapping out where those pattern pieces needed to be. This is why you should not use black duct tape. I sent my boyfriend to the store and didn't think that I needed to specify to not get black duct tape, so I ended up with black duct tape, which is fine. It just meant that seeing my actual lines was a little bit harder. But essentially, I was trying to line them up with the pieces and the seam lines that I wanted them to match up with from the bodice, and then eventually you just cut it out along those lines when you're happy with the shape that you have. Again, don't use black duct tape, but surprisingly a red Sharpie works decently well. And then you just need to have patience and try to cut in as straight a line as possible as you can on a surface that is very bumpy and kind of warped. While the duct tape pattern is great and directly mimics my form, it's not ideal for actually cutting out of fabric because you really don't want to be sticking sewing pins through duct tape. They'll get kind of covered in the sticky gunk. So I wanted to transfer it to parchment paper. And here is where I think I went wrong, and you'll kind of see it impacting me for the rest of this process. I did not necessarily realize how much these pieces would stretch. They were very stretchy, and so I kind of stretched them out as I flattened them against the surface, and I do think this contributed to the patterns being big, on top of me then cutting them out with a relatively significant seam allowance, since in the first place I couldn't actually wrap it all the way around my dress form. So I think I ended up being overly cautious, which I have figured out and will show you kind of how I dealt with it down the line. It didn't end up being too big of a problem, but I do think a little bit more care into transferring this pattern would have been better. Another thing I did not do was measure how much length I actually needed to hit the floor, which I should have done because each one of these dress pieces ended up a different length. Luckily, they're all long enough. However, I absolutely should have measured how long they should be to make sure that they hit the floor with extra to then, you know, use for making the actual skirt.
What I have made from my pattern is a mock-up. This is red, however, this is not any of the fabric I'm going to be using for this dress. This is the original fabric I had bought for my Beetlejuice suit last year, except if you'll notice, it frays like nobody's business, and I did not want to deal with it. However, that makes it perfect for a mock-up because it's not fabric I would use any other time. So, if I find the front of this thing, and we kind of guesstimate where it should go, we see that it actually fits quite nicely and wraps all the way around. Now, I cut this pattern. You can see how wide these seams are. I cut it with a ridiculous amount of seam allowance because the pattern that was made from the duct tape, I don't know, I think you could see it in the video a little bit. I couldn't get it to fully close around the dress form, and so I was really worried that the pattern was going to be too small if I cut it and sewed it perfectly in line with those seams. So I don't think I need as crazy of a seam allowance as I had sewn this with, because in reality, I just need to make up about an inch, maybe a little bit more of difference in the back. Hi, Peanut. You want to be in the video? Peanut. She does not want to be in the video. So that is so crooked. Okay, what's next is I'm gonna still use this because it now fits me better, and I'm going to seam rip. I'm holding it upside down. Again, I'm gonna keep a center back seam. I think it's gonna help me put the zipper in, and so I'm going to seam rip up from this to an amount and then figure out what the godets need to look like, because I have verified that the base pattern fits me and fits me quite well. However, I don't know anything about godets. I've never done anything like this before with a skirt or anything, so I'm going to continue to use my mock-up before I ruin my satin. I need to figure out where my knees are, and I need to mark that, and then seam rip open that point, and that'll tell me how big my godet should be height-wise, and then I just have to figure out. There's cat violence occurring downstairs. I just need to figure out the sweeping, like, I guess the radius that I want it to have, or the width that I want it to have, how much curve it's going to be there. So, because that'll determine how much fabric it actually adds to the bottom. Because very much like a circle skirt, you know, you can have basically a full circle skirt, you can do a double circle skirt, you can even do, you know, smaller, and what it changes is how much flounce you get, how much extra fabric you have at the end. So, that's what's coming next, is I'm going to continue this mock-up and figure out how on earth to make godets. So, here is the mock-up pin to the dress form with a couple godets in. I have 3 in. There is a gap right here, and the third one is just right here. This is the seam that I have talked about possibly putting a slit in. So I just wanted to see what kind of this looked like and how the godets sit. They are not full, like, right angles. They're a little bit more of this acute angle. I don't know. It's there. And I think they lay pretty nicely. I did just a second ago pin it with horsehair braid because that is what I plan to use along the bottom to make sure it gets a really nice flouncy hem. And I am very well aware that doing a complex construction like this underneath a layer that I want to basically drape with as few seams as possible is not helping myself in any way, shape, or form. However, I think it should be super pretty regardless, because even if the lace doesn't end up working, this black dress will still be very Morticia. So that's what we're going for. And there's a few changes I want to make. These are not nearly tall enough, so I am going to move these up to about here. I think that will kind of hit more of the narrowest part of the dress, essentially here, before it flares out again. And then the seam, the slit, if I choose to keep it, I'll probably bring a little bit higher up. I'm not bringing it all the way up the dress. I just want it a little bit past the narrowest part to help me walk. But these are actually, I think they worked pretty well size-wise. And since I have verified the pattern, I compared the pattern to the dress form, and the pieces ended up a little bit, it seems, bigger than the ones I had cut off of me. So that explains also why my extra like giving myself extra on this didn't it translated to more than I expected, and I think it's because my patterns are a little bit bigger than I expected. So I'm just gonna cut and treat them normally. And if anything, I might give myself some extra at the very back on this back seam, just to make sure for zipper install and all of that, that I have plenty there to account for. But yeah, this has been a very successful mock-up so far. These godets definitely need to move at least like 3 inches up, and then I will go from there. And I do believe I have that space at the end, so we'll get that all sorted there. But yeah, this is the mock-up, and I'm very happy I did this, because now I am about to go with confidence to cutting my lining fabric. I'm going to be using my lining fabric first to absolutely make sure that there are no weird issues with it. Again, I'd rather screw up the red satin than the black satin. This is kind of what we're going for, and I think it will give me a very nice, very structured little mermaid moment. Ignore how aggressive my AC is right now. But I have all of my lining sewn. Basically, this is the center front on both of those sides. This is my center back. Since there's 8 pieces, I sewed them up in pairs, and so now I'm going to do I'm going to leave my center back seam open, so I'm going to go sew these 2 together and those 2 together. And yes, I know my seams are wrinkly. We'll get there. It needs to be ironed. Don't worry about it. This is the point where I could do that cool thing influencers do, where they're like, oh, I grab it and then I throw it and it's done. I don't want to deal with the setup and framing of making sure that's consistent. So I thought about it, but I'm not going to do it. So anyways, yeah, sewing time. Woo, magic. Here we go, magic and lighting change. This blob is the lining of my skirt. This is what is going to be actually against my skin, so that you have the nice pretty seams. They are pressed. It's just, again, a curved form, so it's going to be weird. But as you can see, my seam allowance is nicely pressed open on the inside there. And I have these at the end. I didn't finish my seams all the way to the bottom. I do actually, I think, have to seam rim them up a little bit further to actually put my godets in there. But that is what is coming next. And I did toss around the idea of doing the slit in the back of the dress instead of in the front, because that is something you can do for pencil skirts and a lot of other tight-fitting dresses around the knees. However, I think the visual from the front of being able to see the red lining a little bit through the slit is going to be really pretty. So I think I'm still going to do that, and I'm going to do it on the left leg, which means it's actually on this one, when I hold it against myself with the outside, with the seam allowance outside, it'll actually be my left leg, but when I'm looking at the satin, the black satin, it's going to be the reverse. So that's going to be a little bit weird, a little bit tricky. But I fully cut out my black satin, but yeah, I just have to cut out my godets and make sure I seam rip up high enough. That's really what's next, is making sure I line this up. I'm going to put this on the dress form so that I can figure out where my knees actually sit with this, so I can seam rip up to that point and make sure my godets will hit the floor. Yay! So, unfortunately, not all is exactly as it seems. This does fit me well, and I'm not really going to deal with it too much. However, there is still a lot of seam allowance and extra room in the back, to the extent that I have all this room in the center back panel, and that's with this, you know, being as flat as I can make it against the dress form, and it's pulled up pretty high. The corset comes down, so this just also means that, you know, my original pattern probably went up a little bit too high, but that's okay, because I can make sure that it sits me at the right point. Getting this over the curve of my hips is really what matters. And so what I've done is essentially pinned it on her as straight as I can get it, and I will just have to make a new seam in the center back. But notice it's all up here. There is very limited seam allowance down here. I do think the pattern got a lot tighter as it went around my knees. I tried to stand with my knees shoulder width apart, but the tension kind of just kept pulling them in. So that was not great, but this, I think, will be fine. This is going to be in the back of the dress. Again, the front sits beautifully. I don't think this is going to be a problem. I think this, yes, these seams don't line up perfectly. I think when it's under the lace, it's not going to be that big of a deal. You can yell at me in the comments if you think I'm wrong with that. What's next is, she is about as accurate as I can kind of get to where my shoulders and everything sits. So I have where my knees are, so I know where her knees are. And so you can see I have a lot that I need to bring up to, and then I will make sure that my godets are tall enough. A lot of sewing is piecemealing patterns together and trying to understand how you can do that while making the most of your fabric and also paying attention to your grain line. So in order to get these triangles where the grain line is mostly vertical, that means again we need to have that straight be parallel to the selvage edge. So this is how I made them for my mock-up. Obviously it's going to have a little bit of a complication because of the change that I want to make with having the curve at the bottom. So these are, in fact, again, tall enough. They are, if you can't tell, I basically used my cutting board as my measurement last time. The reason these are so far down is because this piece of fabric actually at the top here dips further below, so I can't, it looks like I have more fabric here, but the underlayer doesn't, because the way this is this piece of fabric is folded in half and then folded in half again. What this means is if I cut these triangles out right now, I get 3 triangles, perfectly symmetrical on both sides, because I have a fold right here, so this gets me 1 triangle, and cutting this one here, this fold here is actually doubled, so this gets me 2 triangles. So in this way, when I fold it like this, I can make sure that I get 3 triangles with no seam down the center, completely even to each other generally. I'll need to make sure this fold here on the inside is not perfectly lined up, like all the way down. I can feel down here that the inside fabric is actually here when my outside fabric is there. So again, slippery fabrics like to be a problem. But what I'm going to do is, I think, use this method. I have plenty of satin left. This will get me 3. I need 7 godets. So I have to do this twice, and then I just need 1 more. So this should get me a pretty good number of them. I'm just going to make sure that all my folds are where they should be. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate how I was doing this, because you can fold your fabric in different ways. You can make a lot of it stuff. You can make use of a lot of extra fabric if the grain line does not matter. You can make use of a lot of extra fabric if seams do not matter. Technically, this being the lining, I wouldn't be upset about one of these godets having a seam down the center. However, the way I'm cutting this out, the seam allowance is essentially baked into this seam right here. So that means that this, like for the outside edge, meaning this center edge, there is no seam allowance because it meets up at a point. So I really can't use, like, that's why I didn't use these 2 salvage pieces for a godet, because unless I did it with the most microscopic seam allowance, it would end up smaller than the others. But this is how I'm cutting out triangles. I just have to figure out how to account for how dramatic of like a swoop I want at the bottom, and then making that somewhat consistent across them.
While geometry and I don't get along, it does have a lot of useful applications, and one of them is actually in sewing patterns. So the way that I decided the curve for the bottom of my godets was by folding my triangle in half and bringing essentially its hypotenuse down to the line that was parallel to the grain line and marking that with a pin, and then taking that hypotenuse against the kind of middle-ish of the triangle and marking that with a pin. And what that got me was a gentle curve that would essentially make sure that when I hold it vertical, that the middle part of the triangle hits the floor at the same point that the outer edge of the triangle does. However, these godets are way too big and none of this actually mattered because I'm going to have to trim it by the time it gets onto the dress form anyways. But the next step was seam ripping up to a certain point. This is again where arguably I should have measured beforehand, because if I had measured and was able to stop my seam before it got to the godet, or at that point where the godet should start, I would have been able to secure it better than by seam ripping it. The way that I secured these was I actually decided to go through and just tack those seams closed up at the top, right above the godet, to make sure that there wasn't any weakness or a problem point in the future. So to pin the godets, I started at the top and worked my way down. One thing you have to pay attention to whenever you're dealing with triangles and angles that have a seam allowance is that you are never aligning your point to that start of the seam. It's always going to be offset a little bit because of the seam allowance. Essentially, if you fold your fabric open, you'll see that the line continues, you know, where the seam is, and it won't exactly match up with the edge of the fabric. That's okay, that's what you want. But for me, the process of installing these godets was a little bit interesting because I had a surprise guest. To secure the godets, I did one side at a time because it just made it easier after securing both sides lightly at the top. However, Peanut made this a little bit of a challenge because she was determined to receive attention and headbutt the pins.
I don't think you realize that this dress is sharp, baby. You can't headbutt this dress. You cannot. I cannot let you. I'm more used to Domino being my determined sewing companion, but apparently she has decided that my cutting mat, oh, what she likes is my charging cable. Can we not get near the dress that's covered in stabby things? This is just the Peanut show now. Okay. Are you proud of yourself? Yeah. Hey, sweetheart. We have a lot to talk about. So what I have here, this is my lining, and it has all but one godet. Again, I'm still gonna do the slit, so I have that there. I completely forgot with my original godet pattern that they were already long. So even though I shifted them up, I made the bottoms still a good bit longer. So this will end up trimmed, so I probably didn't even have to worry about curving them because I would have had fabric to trim anyways, but it's fine. Doesn't really matter. The important thing is I learned a lot about installing them, and I kind of knew from the beginning, and I mentioned it when I was talking a little bit about how I was going to sew the skirt onto the bodice. Satin is very slippery, and so getting these joins at the top was actually a little bit of a challenge. And basically, when you sew fabric, you can essentially attack a seam from one of two ways. You know, you can go up either end. What changes is where the fabric passes through the sewing machine. I tend to like it better if the bulk of my fabric is on the left-hand side, and so there isn't bulk in the opening of my sewing machine. Because what happens if you do it the other way and the bulk of the fabric is on the right-hand side, it can be a little bit harder to control. Personally, I find it's a little bit harder to control. It's just more awkward to deal with, and so I will tend to sew seams in such a way so that I always have the bulk to the left-hand side. Now, what this means, though, is I don't always approach seams from the same direction. So, for example, these godets, I sewed one side, basically this side. These would have been, imagine, essentially, I guess no, it's the right direction. I sewed this side of the triangle, starting here, and went down like this, because that meant the bulk of my fabric was on the left-hand side and there's nothing on the right. What I did for a lot of the other godets is I then flipped this around and went from the bottom up. I already hear some of you yelling at me. I understand that this is what I should not have done, and I just kind of proved why, and I'll show you. But essentially, I sewed from here and went up to the point. When you're working with something, this is actually one. Actually, no, this is one of the bad ones. It looks fine from this angle, right? Everything looks fine, but when you flip it, what you see is that they are not joined or meeting properly here. And this is because the fabric shifted. Even if you try to stop it, very slippery fabric will still slip and move ever so slightly. Now, this is the lining, and I'm not really worried about it, but this is why you don't do that. Because some of the other ones, if we see this one, for example, I sewed at the top and went down, and then I sewed at the top here, but in order to do that for this stitch, I had to have the bulk of the fabric to the right-hand side. So that was a little annoying. My seam allowance isn't as consistent, but what it got me is an incredibly beautiful and very well put together seam. I just need to clean up some of those threads, but you can see this looks much nicer than this does. Again, this is the lining, so my level of concern here is non-existent. I'm not worried about it. Yeah, you might see it from the inside. I'm also not planning on competing Morticia in any sort of cosplay contest. The main reason is I don't think she'd win. Cosplay contests, one of the elements that they tend to look for is different types of techniques, and sewing is essentially one category. So while I've done a bunch of different things, like godets are pretty hard, I've made a corset, it's still just sewing, and it would need to be the cleanest sewing I've ever done. And Halloween's coming up faster than I'd like to admit, so I'm not too worried. She's just going to be beautiful and live in my closet. So, the other thing I have is I have the black lining. This is not lining, this is the outside. I have the black satin outside fabric. All my seams for this are nicely pressed. as much as they can be without having a curved surface with which to press them on, so I will probably do some final pressing on my dress form. Also, all the godet seams are pressed, but I made the decision to press them just all over to one side because it was going to make dealing with this triangle here a lot easier, instead of like trying to press these open and then this center would have gotten like really bulky, and I didn't want to worry about that. So I just pressed them all off to the side onto the strips from the main dress. So that's how I pressed those seams open. Again, there is a slit, and then I haven't put the center back one in yet either, which I'll get to that as well. So I have the black satin here, and so I'm going to measure up the same amount that I did on my red. In fact, I'm probably going to drape my red lining on my dress form and then pin the black one on top of it and mark where the red godets started so that these ones start at the exact same point, seam rip up to wherever I need, and then go from there. So the last godet, I had said that I wasn't going to use those extra triangles because it wasn't going to be great. And then I noticed how much red fabric I had left over. It's plenty. However, if I were to cut another full red godet out of it, I was starting to worry that I wasn't going to have enough to figure out the swoop for my sleeves. So in order to preserve fabric and make sure I had enough to do the big swoopy sleeves that I want, and maybe they'll end up being smaller swoopy sleeves, I'm doing this at least for the lining. And that is, I did sew up 2 of those last triangles that were the excess to make one final triangle. And so this is the salvage edge, which is mean and gross and not ideal. I haven't pressed this. I don't really know how it's going to respond to that. I might just press it to one side. This is going to be the center back one. Again, it's the lining, so it might be slightly visible. Those holes might be slightly visible. I'm hoping in the grand scheme of the dress, it hides and it's not a problem. But for the sake of preserving fabric, for the lining, I've gone with this. You might argue that the center back one is actually going to be one of the more visible ones, but again, it's going to be in a swoop, so hopefully, you know, if the lining is all swooped like that, you won't actually see the inside. So I am going to cut out these. I'm debating a little bit because I have so much extra fabric, and that's probably why, you know, I ran out of so much fabric, is because these ones ended up so much bigger. So I might try to find the shortest length of these and figure out how much shorter I need to make them to meet up with this fabric here, and cut the black ones accordingly, so that way I don't waste any more of my black satin than I need, because unfortunately once I cut this off, I don't know that I have another use for it. So there's been a little bit of fabric waste, which is, but I hold on to fabric scraps of almost all sizes. I have some ideas and plans for some personal, you know, this is a personal project, but things I might not film that I'll just have around. But yeah, we have the lining almost fully complete, missing one Frankenstein godet, the black outside fully sewn together, missing its normal godets. So I almost have the full bottom of this, and it's getting heavy. It's not like crazy, but for fabric, like, this is a good bit of fabric. So yeah, I'm glad that I'm gonna put horsehair braid in the hem to keep it wavy, and that I made a corset to help support all of this.
The initial pins you see between the bodice and the skirt, I actually did while I was wearing the dress, because I wanted to make sure that I pulled the skirt up enough so that the curves of the skirt matched the curves of my hip. Once I kind of had that, I transferred it to the dress form, because it is a lot easier to pin something while it is on a stationary dress form instead of my moving body. Something I'd also like to call out, if you see me at any point in this video putting pins in my mouth, know that I am doing something that I know is dangerous. Please don't do this. It can be very dangerous if you suddenly inhale or, you know, gasp or are startled. You could inhale a pin and end up needing to be sent to the hospital. Please be careful. Please do not do this. Do what I say, not what I do. I am aware of the dangers. I do not have a wrist pin cushion. I try to mitigate it by keeping pins in my dress form, like stabbed into it. I'm not always the best at it. That's just a little safety thing. But as far as the dress goes, I tried to keep it even across both sides, which was really hard because I didn't really measure. My seams and pattern was a little bit inconsistent across the two, so I was just doing my best to visually line it up and make sure it was symmetrical on either side before I decided to take it off and sew it. And I did this for both the lining and the outer satin.
Now this is a very confusing image. What you will notice is there's no dress on the dress form. They are both sitting over there. For reasons, I don't know, I just didn't put them on the dress form. So what you can clearly see I'm working on next is the sleeves, because I totally didn't fall into a slight bit of an existential crisis when it came to trying to figure out how to deal with the construction of this next. So what I'm holding here is my Philippa Georgiou cosplay. This is what won me, part of what won me Best Novice. I will only put on half of it right now, but something you will note about this cosplay is her sleeves. We have, you know, she has extra little sleeve details, those were done separate, but she has sleeves that are long and drapey. And I actually, when I draft my own patterns and you see me making notes on parchment, it's not just for that project. I actually keep all of my patterns. The problem is, since we moved into this house, I don't know where they are. So I am patternless, which means I don't have the pattern that I used for the sleeve cap that fits my arm, for this that fits my arm, or for this. So we're making one from scratch. What we have here is a piece of scrap fabric of the same Beetlejuice fabric pinned in one place, which is at the shoulder. I'm going to put Philippa Georgiou down. For dramatic effect, we can adorn. If this is brand new to you and you have no idea what this cosplay is, I highly implore you to go check out that series. This cosplay was the first of many things for me, including basically a sewing project of that scale, technically my second EVA foam chest piece, and my first time winning a competition. But that's not why you're here. So, sleeve, swoop. Except if you look at it from the front, we have some weirdness. So how I made this pattern is I held the fabric at my shoulder and used a Sharpie to very roughly define where my armpit seemed to sit. So where it's going to sit at the top of my shoulder, where it needs to come underneath the bottom of my arm, kind of about how chunky my arm was, and then where my wrist was going to sit. With that, one thing I noticed about these sleeves is that they hang straight, and when I hold my arms like this, they actually hang basically at an angle. If in almost any picture of Morticia you look at, when her arms are like stationary like this, it hangs almost vertical, like completely flat. So in order to achieve that, kind of like how I did the godets on the skirt, I need to curve it a little bit. This was not cut symmetrically. This was cut from just laying it out and then basically cutting it in half, because I wasn't sure if it could be cut symmetrically. And I've learned a couple things from this experiment. One, I did this uneven. I now know which side, the back half, you can't really see it, but this one actually comes to where it needs to underneath, so that is the side I will be replicating for the up top. I have plenty of room. This was technically done with seam allowance, but even with that, I have room, but I don't want to make it too tight because, again, it's satin and it doesn't stretch. And if I flex my arms at all, I won't have room. So I am going to leave the shoulders, like the arm section, a little bit roomy because I do have some chunky arms. So that's not a problem. It's just something I need to account for in sewing. So when it comes to the rest of it, I actually kind of like this shape with a few problems. This length I actually think is pretty decent, and I like this side more than this one. It may just be the way that, you know, it's sitting right now, but I think this side leaves it hanging a little bit more open, so you get a little bit more of that kind of red inside. Here is my sleeve. That's a really short crash course on how I constructed it. So we're gonna be back with sleeve attempt part 2, electric boogaloo, in just a second. Honestly, a few days and 4 sleeve drafts later, I have this. And I am much, much happier with this. Now, notice this shape is a secret third option from the elbow seam and the single bottom seam that I was kind of looking at before. What this is I have a front seam and a back seam coming from about, I think this is actually supposed to sit a little bit more there, and kind of on the back of my shoulder here. I came to this after looking at more pictures of the Wednesday Morticia dress, not specifically the red one, because there's not a lot of like promo photos of like her just standing. It's just like it draped across like a table or something. But there is that one photo that I keep using of her and Gomez, and you can see her sleeves so clearly. So looking at that, I was able to tell there is a seam on the inside, which leads me to believe that there's a seam on the other side, and they constructed the sleeve something like this. We have a much better shape coming from the elbow down. It tends to default hang open a little bit, so you get some of that red on, you'll get some of the red satin on the inside, the black on the outside, and the way that I do the lace sleeve will be different because of some of the edge and trimming, but I'll get to that. But let's talk through some of the iterations that it took me to get here, because clearly I was struggling, if you could tell in the last clip. So that one actually got kind of cut and turned into something else. This was that first sleeve, I think. Yeah, this one was that first sleeve. There's a chunk missing out of it because I cannibalized it for the second one. So this was the first draft where I was able to figure out pretty well what my sleeve cap, what my shoulder needed to look like, and kind of the length and some of the basic dimensions, but really that's all I got from the first draft. When I went to my second draft, I decided to incorporate a handful of changes. One, in order to save fabric, I used a piece that was on the salvage edge, so there's a seam at the top of this one, which is different than that one, and the shape is cut a little bit differently. I tried to clean up my sleeve cap a little bit. The way it flares on the sides is a little bit different, and I changed the shape of the front, making it cut a little bit more dramatically and making the swoop at the front a little less dramatic. I still didn't like the way this sat. So that's where the fourth iteration came in, is I went and I looked at the patterns that I bought from the sewist that I mentioned in my last video for the sleeves and kind of looked at how they laid out their sleeves. Both of those were done with an elbow seam, which again, I'm trying to avoid for random reasons. I just don't really like them. So what I realized is the way they flare the top out is an aggressive shape you will never be able to achieve in a flat 2D sleeve. So essentially something that only has one seam. So I cannibalized that to cut out a random triangle of fabric to put in the top of this to try to create some of that drape. And it wasn't bad. You know, if we look at this, this is technically would go like this for this arm because sleeves, you know, they are mirror images of each other. It hangs like this and it's not bad, but there was still just something off. It didn't hang right. It wasn't quite great. So that's when I went back to the drawing board and I looked at my images a little bit more, and I decided to approach it with a completely different perspective of seams. But what that means is that I had to adjust my pattern. And the thing is, patterns are really cool and you can actually move and manipulate and shift them in a lot of ways. And so that's what the lines on this pattern are, is I was marking out, you'll see it's labeled, one side has, this is the bottom, good job. One side has this little B written in Sharpie and one side has F. That's how I know which side is intended to be the front and the back. For these two pieces, essentially what you see from one Sharpie line to one Sharpie line is the top of that sleeve. And then I had to do the other half, the back, which isn't as simple as just, you know, copying this. You have to like flip it under. I don't know if that makes sense, because essentially you now have the upper, the top rounded part, and then you have the bottom part of the sleeve, which are a little bit different. So I had to mark it out, and instead of cutting this, because I could have cut this, I didn't want to for filming this specifically, but I just used these lines to basically help me draft the pieces that I used for this. And so that is how I was able to get this done. I had to make sure, that's why again there's two F's marked, because the front matters. This scoop works underside the arm, because if you think about the way the sleeve wraps, even though it lays out flat like this, the second piece is where you see the underside of the sleeve, and the scoop like that. I don't know if that made any sense, but I was able to learn something from each of these patterns and get to a sleeve that I actually think is going to work. So I am going to cut this out of my satin. You can see based on how some of the pins are kind of coming off and how tightly it is pinned that I do need a little bit more seam allowance in here up top, because if this is a fabric, this fabric doesn't really have much stretch. I also don't know if I cut this on the grain line, so there may be extra give here that I'm not going to get in my actual sleeve. So need to add some seam allowance, and then this should fit me just fine. But yeah, it took me 4 attempts to get a sleeve mock-up that I'm happy with, and so I am now ready to move forward with the real thing. And I'm so excited because this feels like one of the next, big hurdles, big milestones. And then I have my dress. So hopefully the next clip is what it looks like sewn on the dress. So that's where I am right now. The sleeves are proving a little bit challenging just because geometry and I don't get along. So I'm working on it. I am a little bit stressed because Halloween, by the time this video goes out, Halloween is next week. I am not done. And fingers crossed that I get this done. I will finish this dress even if it takes me longer than Halloween. I will figure something out. I have enough black in my closet. I could probably do Morticia without making this specific dress if I really wanted, but I want to make this dress, so I'm going to try. If you have enjoyed this process up to this point and want to stick around and see the final product and see the process of how I get there, please like this video, subscribe, maybe leave a comment, let the algorithm know that, you want to stick around in this corner of the internet because it's been lovely to have you. And with all of that said, I'll see you in the next one.